So it's actually nice that he was talking about rapid development, because this is one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of Angular, is because of the rapid development aspects of Angular. And so that's, let me just get a quick background from everyone here. Who's working with Angular today? So a big show of hands. Who was actually at the last Angular talk I did like a year ago or so much? So kind of a new group. Who is working with Angular 2? So a couple hands. So this will be new to a lot of people, so that's great. So I've got about 2 hours of content to cover, so I'm going to talk really, no, I'm kidding, it's not that long. But I'm not going to spend too much time on these links. These are different ways you can get in touch with me. I've got my Twitter, my blog, my GitHub repository, and some about work. Really quickly, my company, iVision, we're literally right across the street. I was amazed because I had seen that this switched venues, and I hadn't looked up the address, and then I pulled it up, and I literally crossed the street and show up here. But we're a full technology services firm. I focus on the application development side. We do things in data center, converged network, infrastructure services, etc. If you're curious, I will be posting this deck. There's a link there. You can see some of the areas we cover. But let's focus on what everyone's here for, which is Angular. So what we're going to look at, I'm going to kickstart an Angular app. And hopefully at the end of the day, if you learn nothing else, you'll see how easy it is to get up and running and starting to tinker with Angular. I'm going to talk about why Angular is important and why we use it in so many applications. But then I also want to contrast it with Angular 1. A lot of people have invested a lot of time in the first version of Angular, so why do we even care about the second version of Angular? Show you some tools of the trade. We're going to do a lot of hands-on. And then if we have time, we'll do Q&A. I know there's drinks right afterwards, so we'll be competing with that. But we'll stay as long as there's questions, or at least I will. Everyone else may flood out the doors. So these are the cross-platform tools I'll be showing you. This is the stack I usually present on for Angular. I do work with quite a bit of Microsoft at my job. We also do projects that are completely Node.js based. But this is a stack that truly runs cross-platform. So I think most people are familiar with Node. And how many people are using Visual Studio Code, out of curiosity? So I've seen the number of hands growing. You can certainly use another IDE of your choice on the platform of your choice. Code's nice because it is a cross-platform IDE. It runs equally well on Windows, Linux, and Mac. And so the examples in the UI that I run through are going to be consistent for that. And you can literally take each one of these tools, go online, download them, install them on your platform of choice, and you're ready to get up and running with what I'm going to show you today. So this is the kickstart, and I'm actually going to take these steps in a second. But we're going to use something tonight called the Angular Command Line Interface. And this is a tool for scaffolding Angular applications. It has the added bonus that it complies with the official Angular style guide. So if you're using the scaffolding, you know that the templates you're following. I'm sure anyone who's worked with Angular 1 for any period of time is familiar with the fact that there's probably 1,500 different ways to organize your projects, to handle controllers, to handle watches or not use watches, etc. So this helps standardize some of that. So I'm going to pop over to a Node command line. And so what I've got is just a few directories stubbed out, but we're going to create a new one. And what I literally did before this is I installed the Angular CLI. So I already took that step. Now what I'm going to do is use ng. That's the tool for the CLI interface. I'm going to create a new project. You can also make your own directory and initialize a project if you want to. And I'm going to have to kind of talk like this so it projects through the microphone. Is that?
No, sorry, we can't see the command line.
Can't see the command line.
It's at the bottom.
Great. Come up, up, up. How's that? You want me to zoom in a little bit too? That'll work. Let's zoom in.
It's just too low. It's not that it's too small.
Okay. All right, I can raise it up. Let's do this. How's that? Straight to the top. Perfect. All right, so we're going to call this ATL Meetup Top App. All right, now it's going to spin through. Now it has to install a bunch of Node packages in the background. So while it's doing that, we'll pop back to our slides. Let me cover the first step, which is why Angular. Why do we like Angular for app development? So this is a link to a series of articles I did that I called the 3Ds of web development. But these are 3 keys that I think a lot of people who have been programming for a long time in different technologies find useful in their programming platforms. And one of them, I'm going to actually go a little bit out of sequence, but data binding, dependency injection, and then declarative versus imperative. So declarative versus imperative is pretty straightforward. It's the idea of markup versus code. And one of the powerful features of HTML is it's a markup language. And so it's easier to have a separation of design from development. So you can declaratively lay out your UI and your design and have your imperative coding logic behind that. Angular supports that out of the box, and it does it through a mechanism we call data binding, which is literally just this concept of taking something that represents data, binding it to aspects of the UI, but having that flexibility. And that flexibility can be, for example, if I have a list of widgets, instead of hard coding, for example, emitting elements that turn that into a set of list items, for example, if I'm using data binding, I can specify that separately. I can say, you know what, I want list elements, but if my designer comes back and says, no, these need to be floating divs, I can easily change that in the markup without having to change my code behind. And that's what data binding gives us. And then dependency injection just makes it easier to work on large projects and manage components. So we've got reusable components and templates, code reuse. This fosters parallel development. Angular is very testable out of the box, and performance is also something that we're looking at. Does anyone who's been using Angular for any period of time have a reason they use Angular that jumps out that I might not have covered? Something that, all right, I covered them all. Awesome. What about something up here you don't agree with? What's that? Performance. Good one. All right, so let's talk about why Angular 2. One of the reasons why Angular 2 is something to take a serious look at is the improved performance. So at the recent NG-Conf, the latest version of Angular, 5 times performance through Angular. Now I've spent a lot of time building very complex Angular apps and troubleshooting performance. And the interesting thing about the Angular 1.x stack is that there are certainly ways to improve performance. They're not necessarily prescriptive of the framework, right? It's not out of the box. You can easily make a lot of mistakes that create issues with performance. I still see a lot of code that uses $scope. So that's a code smell. If you're using $scope in Angular 1, that can point to problems. If you're using $watch, there's ways to approach it that don't use those that can actually improve performance, and I've got other resources that talk about that. The Angular 2 footprint is much smaller. The earlier versions were larger. Then they came out with some optimization, so now it's 45K for that initial footprint, and they're working on even streamlining that. We've got CSS management through the concept of web components. Who's familiar with web components as a standard or concept? So basically, here's one of the powers of Angular 2. So there's a standard that's not supported by all browsers and engines of this concept of a formal component that is a group of markup, code, and style that goes together as a cohesive unit. So there's a concept called Shadow DOM that some of you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a way of rendering that optimizes the way the browser outputs HTML, and it allows for this concept of partition styles. So there's no more massive CSS and you can still use Less Than Sass and all these tools, but part of the reason why we had to use these tools is because we're managing so many different types of assets. And so we have this huge CSS file that manages the entire application. Now you can look at a component. So if you're drawing a business card, instead of worrying about the styles for the rest of the application, you can deal with the CSS specific to that component. What Angular will do for you is in the browsers that support it, it'll use this natively. In the browsers that don't support it, it will generate compiled CSS that is still unique by component, so it will emulate that functionality. So you code it once and you hit the standard regardless of what the target browser is. You've got this concept of module prefixing, and I'll show you how to make a component. But if I make a component now, that component references all of its pieces in a relative way that moves with the component. So if you're reorganizing a project, you can pick up the component, move it somewhere else in the tree, and it'll automatically move its references to the assets. That's pretty powerful. We've got the concept of server-side rendering with Angular Universal. If you're wondering what that is, it's the fact that Angular is split out rendering from the rest of the library. And they have a browser renderer, but they can now render in different environments. You can actually render on the server and then have it seamlessly integrate with the client. It seems too good to be true, but if you look at the Angular Universal talk that came out of the NG conference, you can see how they make that happen. It's actually pretty amazing through a technology called Zone that's a part of Angular. Testing support is still there. I'm going to show you the scaffolding with Angular CI, and then I'm going to talk about TypeScript. So for the teams I've worked with, we've been with TypeScript since its beta, and it's definitely been a pro, and it's been an asset for development. I know there's mixed views out there, and it really depends on the size of the team and the background, but we've found just an amazing boost, and I'll get into a little bit of why that is. So for why TypeScript, I could spend an entire hour going through TypeScript. I'm going to save you that time and try to get you out of here at a decent hour. But these are some quotes that I pulled off, and obviously anyone can search for good quotes and bad quotes, but I thought these were pretty powerful, and I think, you know, for the open source community, there may have been some stigma associated with TypeScript coming out of a Microsoft project. It's a truly open source language, and teams that are larger teams. Now, if there's a superstar JavaScript developer in the back room building an app, that superstar developer may never need to worry about TypeScript. They know the ins and outs of the language. If you're working with a team, you have parallel development, you have concerns about hiring new people to come in and ramp up on the application, TypeScript solves a lot of problems that you get that JavaScript, it's not that JavaScript is flawed as a language, you can do great things with it, but it is difficult to scale and discover and understand the intent of an API, understand what the signature of a parameter will be, and catch some mistakes that are very forgiving in JavaScript at development time. If you want to learn more, there's a simple link for you to remember. It's a bit.ly link, TypeScript vid, TypeScript VID, and that's an hour-long video that walks you through some of the features of the latest version of TypeScript, so you can see things like interfacing, class declarations, Lambda expressions, how it captures this, decorators, aspects, the whole 9 yards. There's a lot of capabilities in the language, and what's great is it follows parity with the ECMAScript specifications, so you're always writing code even when it's in TypeScript that looks very familiar to either JavaScript today or how the next version of JavaScript is going to look. Is anyone using TypeScript on a regular basis besides me? It's okay, don't be shy. Hands up high. No, that's okay. So small percentage, but hopefully after this talk you may get a little more curious. So these are some of the features that the Angular CLI scaffolding give us out of the box. I'm going to demonstrate these. Let's pop over. So it's created my directory here. So I'm going to go into the ATL meetup top, and I'm going to type ngserve. What ngserve is going to do is build the scaffolded app and open up a port for us to browse to it on. And I'm going to use my Chrome, and it's going to open 500,000 windows. So we'll close those out quickly. I actually thought I had an instant open, and look, oh, that's the wrong one, but I was in Tech 404 Slack. So if we go to our local host, and the time it took me to walk through, we've got a fully working app. So I've got a web server up that's running an Angular app. So we've gotten that far. You'll also be happy to know that if you run your tests, it's going to build the application. It's going to spin up Karma as a test runner. Use Jasmine for the tests themselves. We'll let it spin up and build really quickly here. So here's the browser stub that it can run it through, and you'll be happy to know all our tests are passing. So that's a good sign, and we can leave this up and let this run continuously in the background. So if I come to my other node command prompt, and since I created this on the fly, I have to remember ATL meetup. Let's go into code. So I'm going to open the source code for the project. And I'll zoom in on the code when I open this up, but I've got a specification here. And let's zoom for you. So right now it's creating sort of a dummy specification that says it should create the app, which is great, and then it should have this title, ATL Meetup Top Works. So if I change this and remove the exclamation mark and I save it, it's going to recompile, rerun the test, and it's going to fail the test on the fly. So nice workflow. If I had the web server serving, it would also refresh my web page on the fly and make that. So let's put this back in, save it, and then you can also do end-to-end testing. So end-to-end testing uses a tool called Protractor, which gives you an object graph that provides insights into the rendered DOM. So you can do things like query for a button inside of a div, click that button, and write what I would call a coded user interface test and simulate it to that. So you can test at the Angular unit test level. You can also test at the integration test level. So those are all of the out-of-the-box benefits that we get from this. So what I want to do now is walk through making some changes to the application. So right now, if we look at how the application was scaffolded, we've got a few key components here. So I've got type definitions. So this is something that's going to give me auto-discovery in IntelliSense. And if I install third-party modules, I can install type definitions for them and learn about the API. I've got a configuration for the TypeScript compiler. I've got a configuration for the components that get built. I've got a main piece here. Now this is TypeScript syntax. I'm importing this module from a path. I'm importing this module from a path. This is my top component here that it's scaffolded, Atlanta Meetup Top App component. And then basically it's bootstrapping with that component. So it's saying spin everything up with this top level component. So if we look at the component has a few parts. There's a specification for testing. There's a component itself, which right now just sets a title. So you can see this class has a title on that. And then we've got this interesting thing here, which we call a decorator. So this is an aspect of the application. So it's a way I can tag code and inject behavior after the fact. So this would be a pure class, and in fact in ECMAScript 6, I could literally just take this code as is and it would work. Now I'm decorating it and giving it some enhanced metadata. I'm specifying how we invoke this component in HTML. I'm specifying the template for the component and the styles for the component. So if we look at the template right now, this is our data binding. We're just binding to that title property. So if I come back and launch my server, so we'll spin it up and then we'll do the whole broccoli. Anyone work with broccoli at all? So as far as I can tell, it's a way of looking at the code tree and basically optimizing how it recompiles on the fly. If anyone knows more than I do, feel free to correct me, but it's a component that's built in, and that's where you see anytime I save. So you can see what we have here. So if I come over into my Angular code, and let's just add X, Y, Z, save that, we're going to see this senses the change, and then we're going to see in our website XYZ appears. So pretty straightforward in that sense. Probably if you're writing an application, you'll have reusable code. So in Angular, a component is going to be behavior with a template and a style. If you just have reusable code, something that talks to a service, something that serves information, you're going to use a service. So let's go ahead and scaffold a service. So I'm going to do my CLS, take it to the top, ng, generate service, and I'm going to call it application. So I'm just creating an application service. Maybe I have my own settings in it, maybe I have a version number, maybe I have a title. So within this service, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out of this component this title. So we'll grab that and we'll expose it as part of the service. So the service has a test, so I'm ready to do this, and I could do test-driven development. It's 808, so we'll probably just dive straight into code, even though we swear that testing speeds everything up, right? It does in the end. But so we'll come into this, and I'm just going to create a property. We'll call it title, because I'm feeling very creative. And set that there. So all this is doing right now is a title. It could do more interesting things, but I'm just showing you how the scaffolding works. So I'm going to save that. It's going to recompile. It's not going to really change a thing right now, because now we have to pull it into our component. So the way we pull it into our component, first I need to reference the code itself. So the code that was generated gives me this application service class. So when I reference that, I'm going to import from, and the path is application.service. And then I should have some auto discovery here that lets me know there's an application service inside it. So that referenced the code. Notice I didn't go into HTML and add another JavaScript source include or anything else. I just did this import statement. And then the only other thing I'm going to tell it is that it's important for dependency injection. So that's a provider, and I'm telling it we're interested in the application service. So that tells Angular that it needs to pass me the application service. And so now the last thing I need to do is, let's turn the title into sleeping, is in my constructor, I'm going to ask it to pass me that service in. So I'm going to create a constructor. I'm going to tell it I want a service. The type of the service is this application service. And then what I'm going to do with it is set the title to the title from the service. So you can see here we set it to Z. If I save that, it'll refresh, same site. So now I've just integrated a third-party service. So that's kind of interesting, but what Angular 2 differentiates from Angular 1 is when we start interacting with the markup, in Angular, everything happened through a directive. So anytime you wanted to do a special binding, create a special directive, you had to write a certain set of code. What Angular does for us, Angular 2, is it provides a standard set of ways for interacting with the DOM. So what do I mean by that? What I can do is create a select box. Notice I'm not giving it an ID, I'm not binding or tagging it. Just going to do a set of options. I'm going to call this one red. And then we'll make another one, and another one. Let's just do our standard RGB. So we're going to do red, green, and blue. So right now it's not going to be very interesting at all. I'm going to save it, and you should see a select box, which is straightforward HTML. So I can pick that. Let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, so that's fine, nothing special there. But let's say I wanted to set this color. So what I'm going to do is, the way I would normally style this is I would give it style equals color orange. Right, I can do that. It's not recommended because we want to use CSS, but that'll do the trick. Well, if I want to do it through data binding, my path here is style, and with inside style is color. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's say style.color. So when I put the square braces, that means I'm going to bind something into that DOM property, and I'm going to give it, well, let's do orange, and it's not going to work, and that's because what I'm passing it is an expression. So you can see it's black, it didn't turn orange. That's because I gave it an expression that it can evaluate. So if I wrap orange in a single quote and save this, what it's going to do is crash. Yeah, I got that extra quote. I love all the debugging on the fly. Appreciate it. All right, and so it's orange. So now it's an expression. Let's do something more interesting. So here's a DOM element. I want to reference that DOM element. So I'm going to give it a local variable. To create a local variable, we just use pound and give it a name. So if I give this pound color, I immediately have access to this DOM element anywhere within these expressions. So now what I can do is come up here and I can bind it. Now this expression is going to look the way it is, not because of Angular, but because this is how the DOM properties work. What I need to do is I specify color, so that's my select element in HTML, my DOM element. And then it has a collection of options. What's interesting to me is the option at the selected index, and I want to get the ID of that. Does that make sense? It's something you would do in just straightforward JavaScript. So when I save that and refresh, we're red. Now I'm going to change it to green, and nothing's going to happen. Does anyone know why? No data binding. So I bound to a property, but there's no two-way data binding. There's nothing. So Angular 2 highly optimizes the data binding experience. It's one way by default. And so it's not going to use unnecessary watchers. You have to let Angular know something's important. So there's a few ways we can do it. I can actually trick it and use another way. So I showed you the square brace style for binding to a property. I can also bind to any event by putting it in parentheses instead of on. So if there's an on change event, all I have to do is in parentheses say change. And what I'm going to do is right now I'm just going to say y equals 1. All I'm doing is updating something on the model. So Angular says, oh, something happened. We need to reevaluate what data bindings look like. Just by doing that, we can now turn it red, green, and blue on the fly. Probably something more interesting would be maybe to take this expression out. And when this changes, say my color equals that, and then set this to my color, what will happen is when we first start, my color is undefined because we haven't selected anything. Once we change and select something, it'll update. So we're getting a little bit closer, but what would be even more interesting is why am I even bothering with hard coding these options here, right? I mean, it's pointless when I can do something like this. Let's expose a property called colors. That's a string array. Let's give it red, green, and blue. And then let's do a selected color. And let's go ahead and initialize it. Well, we'll do that in the constructor. So let's make it orange. And then in our constructor, we'll say this selected color equals this color is 0. So now what I'll do, it's not going to change the behavior yet because I haven't done anything in the HTML. So let's come back here and go into our HTML. And I'm going to bind this to selected color. And take this out, take the change out. So we'll save that. First thing we should see is just, there's our default color. So I got the initial binding. Then what I need to do is build some options. So let's build our options out. So what I'm going to do is use a special Angular directive. So when you're producing multiple templates, so if I'm repeating something or creating something that's dynamic HTML, I use this asterisk. So this asterisk is telling me for NG4, I'm actually going to repeat this option template. So this is a template directive. What happens with this is it uses the surrounding HTML as a template for what I'm doing. So I'm going to say let color of colors. So that's going to iterate through the colors I exposed on my model. And then I'm going to say my ID is the color. And then I'm going to data bind to, or I'm going to set the inner text to the color as well. So if we do that, we should get the same thing, except this will be lowercase instead of uppercase or some nonsense like that. So now I've built my options list dynamically. The last step I'm going to do, so I showed you that the braces are one-way data binding to the property, and the parentheses react to events. Angular gives us this special construct called the model that handles both events and binding so that I can facilitate two-way data binding. And it's smart enough to understand the HTML element that it's on. So if I happen to be on a select it's going to understand how to look at the selected option and wire that up for me. So if everything goes as planned, and we wire that model up to the selected color, we save that, we refresh, and does anyone need to cross their fingers for this, or should I just click it? Okay, he's got me. And it's green, or it's blue. Make sense? Yes, no, confusing? So I'm able to code this on the fly because I understand the syntax and then literally any element. But let's go ahead and make our own HTML tag, just for the fun of it. So what I want to do is create a component. So I'm going to ask it to generate a component, and we're going to call this a tile. I'm just going to make a simple tile. Not very artistic, so if I do much beyond a square, it's going to turn out poorly. So we just scaffolded this tile. You can see it's in its own directory over here. Let me scroll it up a little bit for you. And so for the tile, I'm going to make it pretty simple. The template for the tile is just going to be a div. We'll just put an empty space inside the div for now. And then that localized styling I talked to you about, this CSS, I'm just styling this component. It's not going to affect any other divs. So we'll give it a width of 100 pixels, we'll give it a height of 100 pixels, we'll give it a border that's solid 2px red. No, I don't want that. And then we'll make it background. Let's make the default background. Looks like an interesting color that they actually put in the, how about just light coral for kicks and grins. All right, so we've got our component, which doesn't do anything. We've got our template, and we've got our CSS. One of the things that this did for me, which I didn't ask it to, it was kind enough to make this app-tile. So that's to avoid collisions if I use reusable components. For the purpose of this, we could just leave it to app-tile. If I had a different name of my app, it would scaffold it differently. Or it's based on the path. I'm sorry, so app to tile. So this is how I put it in my markup. If I come up here and just go ahead and drop in a tile and save it, Angular is not going to do anything for me because I haven't really told it about the tile yet. I haven't wired up the JavaScript, I haven't wired up the component. So to do that, we'll come into the top level component, and we're going to import this definition. So I'm going to import from, and I'm just giving it the path to the tile. And now it'll tell me tile component. So again, that's just referencing the component. The other thing I'm going to let it know is this is something that can render on the UI. So I'm going to tell it, as far as directives are concerned, please go away, thank you. We want the tile component. So we'll save that, and someone probably already caught too that I used the wrong selector for this. This should be app-tile. Fix that really quickly. And we've got two beautiful tiles that I drew myself on the fly, live in front of the audience. Pretty impressive? Look good? All right, so we probably want to change the background of our tile, right? That would be something useful to do. So let's go ahead and go back into the tile component. And what I'm going to do is give it a property called background. And I'm going to initialize it to gray. We'll make it boring. And then inside of my template here, I'm going to, now this, bear with me, I'm on a div. Div has a background property that's inside style, right? Style.background. So we're going to take the style.background of the div, and we're going to bind it to the background property of our component. Make sense? So this is just an expression to the code behind. So if we do that, we've got boring gray tiles. So now what I want to do is be able to specify this in the top level. And let's go ahead and say background equals green. And background equals, oh, actually, why don't we just go ahead and bind it to selected color? That'd be more fun, and then we'll make the other one orange or something. How's that sound? Okay, so let me just organize this so it's easier to read. So this one's actually bound to the same color as the heading. This one's bound to an expression that's just the literal orange. Now when I do this, nothing happens because I haven't told Angular how to make that connection yet. I expose the property, but for all it knows, that could be a property I'm using to configure my component, to do code behind, etc. All I need to do is come into my components code, and up here where I'm importing, I'm going to import something called input. And on this selected, not selected color, actually I'm in my wrong component. That's okay. Let's come down here. So we're going to go ahead and import input. And I'm just going to tag this property. And now what I'm telling Angular is, hey, someone can bind into this property. So let's save that, let the screen refresh. And now we're in some weird state that is unexpected. So we did background, string equals gray, input.
Do you use space between colon and string?
What's that?
Do you use space between colon and string?
No, that's not it. So we've got background. Well, that's weird that it returned to, oh, you know what? It helps if I save my files. There's something that didn't save. I feel very confident that we're going to see not so amazing things happen. You know, this is really getting on my nerves now. All right, so do we default the color here? So we've got background equals background. How is it even finding coral? All right, when all else fails, blame it on the broccoli. Let's see if we can rebuild this and maybe get a better result. All right, so I have no coral here. I have no coral here. I've got orange, but we're not even seeing orange.
Don't you have to put inputs in parentheses?
All right, so we've got an app tile, we've got a background, we've got selected color. So that'll turn into an actual selected color. We've got orange.
Isn't your background color?
What's that?
Wouldn't it be background dash color instead of just background?
Oh, you know what? It's my, no, I got styled up background. All right, maybe it's a collision of names. Let's make this background input. We'll try that. We'll change this to background input. All right, we got them gray. That's a little bit better. So now it's binding to the right one. As far as my component's concerned, so we've got background input. We did add input. This is a mystery. I'm not going to waste too much time on it, I promise you. But
That's input.
yes. Oh, I know what the problem is. I didn't even follow my own advice. We didn't do that. I'm trying to treat it as a regular property that I'm just setting a literal to as opposed to using the data binder. So now we'll do this. And first off, I want to thank you for being patient with course correction. I'm 100% confident that we are going to get some magic on the screen. And there we are. All right, so we're going to do one more thing. It would be nice if this component could interact with the outside world, right? Unless, does anyone write components that don't interact at all? Some, maybe. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in two more. We're going to bring in an output and an event emitter. So on this, I'm going to create a public, and let's call the property path. So that's an event emitter of type Boolean, and we'll just go ahead and do it up right here. Does anyone not understand the syntax, what I'm doing here? It's okay if you don't. Not very many people are in TypeScript, so won't be surprised. So this is a generic strategy. Anyone who works with Java or C# may be familiar, but this is saying that I'm creating an object of type T. So let's say this object takes a parameter. I can create a strategy that says we can specify what the type of that parameter is, and then when I'm referencing it, it's going to automatically know that, hey, I'm expecting a Boolean input or a string input or something more complex. So what will happen is, if I use my IntelliSense, like let's say I wanted to just emit an event here, I would do tapped, actually this, tapped, emit, and then what you can see is it automatically knows it's a Boolean that it's expecting. So if I try to pass it a string, it's going to say, no, you told me up here it's a Boolean. So it's a way to create type safety within your application. I'm not going to do anything here. All I'm going to do is go back to my HTML. So now I have this tapped property that I'm going to specify as an output property. And then here, I'm going to take the click event that's on the div. So I can do this with any event. I can do it with Blur or whatever I want. And then when that click event fires, I'm going to say tapped, emit, true. So I'm just going to emit the event on my component. So right now, we just want to make sure it loads, everything's fine. And so now what I'm going to do is on my parent component, I now have a tapped event that I can bind to, just like any other DOM element. So just like I have click and change, I now have tapped. And so when it's tapped, I'm going to play a dirty trick and selected color equal to what's someone's favorite color?
Chartreuse.
Is that a HTML spec color?
Fuchsia.
Fuchsia?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to go with violet. Is that a color? I don't even know. We'll try it. All right, so we've got red, we've got green, we've got blue, and now let's tap it. And we're violet. So now we've wired down to components through brace binding, and we've percolated up. We're at 8:30. Do we want to see one more example? Are you hungry for more? Or do you want me to start wrapping up? Are you like, this thing's droning on and on? I've got 420 on my line. What's the deal? More. Okay, we'll make it fast. So last thing I'm going to do is go ahead and make a route for you. I'm going to stop my live server because generating routes generates a lot of code, and Broccoli gets so confused. There's this file, there's that file. So I'm going to generate a route, and I'm going to call it Markdown. So we'll scaffold that. And you'll notice there's a little plus in front of this. That's because Angular by default now creates lazy loaded routes. And so by convention, those will have a plus. And it means it's not going to load the assets for that route unless someone actually navigates to it. You can also create permanent routes that are loaded up front. By default, it creates a lazy route. So we have to find a way to get to the route. My scaffolding automatically extended my component definition for me. So now it's pulling in all of my route requirements, router directives, requirements, passing them in here. I'm just going to let it know that I'm actually using some router directives in the code. So I'm just passing that there. And you can see it actually specified the route and the path and what component to load for that route. That's the way you do it in Angular. When you go to this route, this is what you grab. So in the HTML, I'm going to add something called a router link, and I'm going to bind it to a hard-coded markdown, and I'm going to say check the markdown. So we'll save that. See if the app, oh that's right, I stopped the server, that's okay. Spin that back up. All right, we'll refresh that. And Houston, we have a problem. Let's see what it's complaining about. There's actually much better, no provider for router. Oh yeah, so we included it, but we didn't tell it that there's also router providers. Do you see how clear that error message was though? Do you remember in Angular 1 when something would happen? Module didn't load? You'd be like, what did I do? Someone told me exactly what was missing. Hopefully we'll save it. I will inform Angular 2 we're live here. Please work with me. Perfect. Okay. So we got that. And now we have to check the markdown. Now before I fix this though, I can't stand this font. So let's come back into the CSS. So when you're in the top level CSS, you don't really, you could style the body tag if you wanted to, but you want this to be modular, and this component's hosted somehow, right? So there's a virtual wrapper around the component. So all you have to do in the CSS is just tell it that you're styling the host. So now this is the container for your component, not the template itself, but what the template's contained in. And I'm just going to tell it to use a font family, and I like the AHS family. They're a good group. So we'll load that, and now we've got the new styling. And then if we check the markdown, markdown works. So we just navigated to a route. You can see that up in the URL. Pretty simple. We should actually make markdown do something really quick. So for my last example, what I'm going to do is, is anyone familiar with Showdown? So let's go ahead and install Showdown, which knows nothing about Angular 2, by the way. So we're going to install Showdown, save it to our developer configuration. Hope that we've got a decent connection and it won't take too long. Everyone knows this trick, right? Counterclockwise cursor speeds everything up. It's actually easier to do with a mouse, but okay, so now we've got Showdown. So now what we need to do, and I'll actually come back to my presentation, and again this will be posted so you can see all these steps, is we want to extend the app. So we did the tile, we did the route for Markdown, we saved Showdown. So there's a couple places that I go inside Angular to let it know I'm using a third-party module. So the first thing I'm going to do is let Angular's build process know that I have a new asset for it to put out in the distribution directory. So it takes the TypeScript components, compiles them, you can bundle them, you can put them into Webpack. There's a huge document on how to do that, and you serve them. So part of what we're doing now is the Showdown, there's a distribution, and we're going to reference the JS. That just gets it out into my deployment, and I'm done there. The next thing that I need to do is actually configure it for System.js. So System.js is the module loader, and what System.js does for us is dynamically loads the components or provides a means to bundle those components at compile time. So what we're going to do is come into our system config, and we're going to add a map, and that's going to be Showdown. So whenever I reference the module Showdown, where I output my distributions to is in a subdirectory called vendor, and we could go through that. If we come up here, there's this distribution directory, you have app and vendor. So it's vendor, and then we're going to do Showdown and distribution. So that just tells it where to look when I import it. The next piece is for the package. We need to tell it some things about how does it actually get invoked. So if it's plugged into a module, you can dynamically load it just by importing it into the module. We're going to use Showdown as just a generic ambient, it's a global library. So what we're going to tell it is that the main file to reference when we're working with Showdown is showdown.js. And then we're going to tell it that the format is global. So it's just like a globally included file. So now Angular and more importantly System.js know how to integrate that within my app. So now if I look at this Markdown, what we're going to do is come into the component. So first thing I'm going to do is import Showdown. Now there's a whole other set of steps I could go through to import the TypeScript IntelliSense and everything else. For expediency's sake, I'm going to do the TypeScript equivalent of a catch-all and just call this any for now. But you could come back and actually wire in type definitions and have strong typing and IntelliSense and everything else. So now what we're going to do is after the component's initialized, so that means the view's out there, it's rendered, everything's in place. Let's go ahead and create a property called this.message. Have not initialized yet. And that's actually going to be public message string. And so in my markdown component, let's just go ahead and show that message. So if we save that, we should get this refreshed. Am I still serving? No, I stopped serving because I imported Showdown. That's okay. So I do serve. Gotta wait for it to compile. It's actually serving, but it's not serving anything. There we go. So now we'll navigate directly to Markdown. Markdown works. It obviously did not find my message. Let's try saving everything. And let's close the div actually. Probably be a lot happier if we did that. File not found, vendor showdown disk. All right, let's go back to our cheat sheet. Did I put the trailing slash? Is that what it's complaining about? Man, this thing's picky. Who does that? Oh, and of course I've got to create a new deployment, so to build it. By the way, you can build it without actually serving it with ngbuild. Okay. See, it works. Now we'll serve it. Test this again, and it's still complaining. So what went wrong?
Your packages, you have to tell it that it's showdown, like in your example.
So package has showdown here.
Now in your slides,
Oh, did I not update the package definition?
in the system config, right, you have main and format, so that doesn't know that it's showdown. Your example has it slightly different in your slides.
Okay, so what do I have? I have main and format showdown as, yeah, I forgot to tell it that I'm actually, thank you very much. If I had a prize, I would give it to you. This is beautiful. Look at that. And I bet we have not initialized yet. All right, so we've got 2 steps, one mandatory, one optional. We're going to do the mandatory step here, and after initialization, I'm going to say let converter equals new showdown.converter, and then I'm going to say this message is converter make HTML, and then I'm going to give it, so pound is an H1 tag, hi, carriage return, hello, carriage return, 1, carriage return, 2. So this is Markdown. Anyone not familiar, it's an easy, quick way to mark up documentation. We're passing that in. What we're hoping is it'll make that into HTML and actually spit that out. And so what really happens is that it makes it into HTML and spits it out. Probably not what we want the end user to see. So what we can do is come into our code, because what I'm doing is actually showing the message inside the div, which defaults to the inner text of the div. Does anyone know what the property of a DOM element that's a div is that allows HTML? Inner HTML. So inner HTML using our binding format equals message. This won't matter anymore. Let's save that, refresh it. And we just translated Markdown in our Angular app. Okay, so now we're at 8:40. I could go one step further, 2 minutes, and load it from a file, or we can run. Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up. All right, let's make it into a file. Let me see if I can type much faster now. So let's go into our app, and to make things simple, well, we'll do it in Markdown. Let's create a new file, and we're going to call this just tempmv. This is live. This is a subtitle 1, 2, 3. Visit my blog. I had to get a plugin here somehow. Coder blog. Okay, so that's the Markdown syntax for that. Within Visual Studio Code, we can preview it, make sure everything looks fine. That's great. So let's save that. So now I have a file. I have to get to the file somehow, right? So what do? Well, guess what? Believe it or not, my presentation comes with more sheets. So what we need to do is go into Visual Studio, and Angular by default, like it or hate it, doesn't import the Angular HTTP module. So we're going to add it here to our packages, HTTP, give it the same version as its peers. Okay, so that does that, and then everyone knows what we need to do next, correct? npm install. So go out, find my HTTP, drop it in. I guess I could have actually done np install, saved that too. So I just showed you 2 different ways to add packages. All right, so we've got that pulled in, and we're good there. So now let's go into our Markdown. And so what we want to do is import our HTTP, our HTTP providers. So this is all the scaffolding that lets us make calls from Angular HTTP. So far, so good. In my constructor, I'm going to ask it to inject that dependency for HTTP. So I have it available to my component. And the final thing I need to do is import a reference to RxJS, because that's the default subscription model. React is what Angular uses out of the box. If you want to go back to that old style that people used to do with promises, you can convert Rx to promises. That's their prescriptive way of doing this. All right, let's get it started. Okay, so this HTTP get, what are we getting? App plus Markdown for the lazy loaded path, temp.md. So that's what we want to do. We're going to ascribe to an event that will get a response. So this is what's called Gozinta. This is the Gozinta symbol, because this goes into this. And because it's TypeScript, we get IntelliSense. So what is this thing we get with a description? It has all these methods. So what we want to say is let text equal result as text. So you can cast a result to text, to JSON. You can do other conversions. So this is letting you work with file formats the way you want to. Let's go ahead and pull this out. And this time we'll just make HTML from the text. I think that was close to the 2 minutes I promised you. Of course, it has to work, right, when I compile it. So, all right, so what did we do? We brought in HTTP. I called GET. I subscribe to the stream of events that come back from the GET. When that stream fires, give me the next item in the stream, which is the result. Turn that into text. Pass it through my converter. Save it. Hi, hello, 1, 2. If you're not impressed with that, let's come back to our Markdown. And it's the wrong one, of course. That's because I stopped the server. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that it hadn't refreshed yet, so this would be much more exciting for you. All right, we're loaded. Let's come back to our root. Okay, so we have cool tiles that change colors for us. We can make it green. Check the Markdown. Check the Markdown. All right, let's pull it open. I said we had great error messages, so this one is going to be no provider for HTTP. Okay, I forgot to tell my component that I wanted that to be injected. Again, did I mention that these error messages are nice and clear and prescriptive? I actually just wanted to show you that error message so you knew how to do it. I don't think anyone believes me, but let's check the markdown. And we're live. We made it. Thank you. Applause. Okay, let's come back to this. Now, before I open it up to questions, I want to reiterate. So I've been working with Angular 2 for a while. We're not doing production with it yet. If you're on Angular 1, look at ng forward, ng metadata, ng upgrade. Those are all modules that let you work with Angular 2 and Angular 1 side by side, give you a path to upgrade those. We've been working with Angular since Angular was in the beta, so multiple years now. This type of rapid development, although it's impressive to do some easy things in demo, the real power for us from this comes from teams and being able to do these types of things in parallel. Having different team members work on different components, having the designer be able to work on the CSS and markup while the developers working on the JavaScript, and then the TypeScript edition gives us things that, look, all JavaScript is valid TypeScript. Take that JavaScript file, rename it TS, you're good to go. But then you add metadata, classes, type annotations, captures that work correctly so you don't have to worry about what this is all the time, and you've got a very powerful tool for scaling. So are there any major questions based on the fire hose I just sprayed on everyone tonight? Yes, sir.
I want to ask, do you know of any, I guess two questions. Do you know of any good online tutorials for Angular 2?
Angular.io. So that's the main Angular site, and I have a walkthrough for that. I would plug the video tutorial I did, but it's not updated, so I can't go there. It's too old of a version. I'm trying to think what else. I usually branch off. So if you go to angular.io/resources, there's actually links to Pluralsight courses, free tutorials, and other assets there. But Angular itself has a quick start that lets you walk through into it for that. I'll also show you, I put the link up for my GitHub repository, and although this will be a little dated, it's actually still pretty relative and it's typed to the version, but there is a repository called, interestingly enough, Into TypeScript Lab. And that will walk you through every step of building an app, not using the command line interface though. This is the manual way of doing it. So that's another example that you can look to. But I would go to angular.io, that's the official Angular 2 site. I believe they have a resources link now, and then you're going to see a ton of resources there. Does that help? Yes?
You showed us a couple times injecting providers in the component, but I know sometimes you can do it at the bootstrap with the app component itself. Can you talk about when you want to do that?
Sure. So injectors, dependency injection in Angular 2 is hierarchical in its scope to what needs it. So if I have a component, inject a provider, I'm not guaranteed what copy of it is. It's done on demand for that component. If I want to create a singleton version, so I want that one service to be that exact copy, there's a few ways I can do it. An easy way is just to bootstrap the app with it. So automatically bootstrapping the app with the service will make that service a singleton because that parent is already handled, and so that's what gets injected. There's also a syntax called provide that allows you to specify how, when I request a component, it's delivered. And you can do that by type. You can create a factory function. You can do whatever you want inside of the code. You can declare a constant, pass a constant in, and that'll give you full fidelity over which instant you get. Did you have another question?
Yeah, you were using Visual Studio Code.
Yes.
Do you know if there's a way to retheme it so it has a light background instead of a dark background?
I don't, and I don't want to. But no, I love that. No, I get it. Some people like light. There probably is a way out there. I've just never looked into it.
And that's why I don't like certain other tools that might look like that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. I assume there's some premium. We can do some live coding right now and go into probably file, there's probably a preferences somewhere.
Under 5.
What's that, under file? Preferences, color theme. So the answer is yes. I'm not going to do this to myself and make it like contrast, but it's there. Yes?
How hard is it to deal with like ES5 or ES6 versus TypeScript?
So it is as hard as in your, not TS-lint, in your TS-config, changing the target to ES6.
Like, well, now if I didn't want to use TypeScript.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So right now, there are tutorials out there that use that. The Angular team, so what I showed you with the command line interface is right now tied to TypeScript. The Angular team committed to making versions of that for regular JavaScript, whether it's ECMAScript 5 or 6. You know, a lot of people use Babel in their workflow, and also Dart, which I don't know why. Are there any Dart developers in here, by the way? So they're trying to keep Dart alive for whatever reason. But so they will update it for that. So the answer is I don't know how difficult it is because that's not the workflow we use, but I know Angular's committed to integrating that. And all their documentation is available in TypeScript, JavaScript, or Dart. Yes.
So we're targeting the version into ES5, and say, for example, we need to debug the code.
Yes.
So we're written in TypeScript. So when you do the source mapping, so the line goes in the browser during the debug, is it going to map the TypeScript, or is it still going to be JavaScript?
You can debug in whichever one you want. So my default target is ES5. And if I'm still running the server, which probably not, well, let's not run 2 instances, which I am. So if we come into our local host here, and I open up my favorite window, for some reason I'm always in it, and then I open up app, markdown. So I can either choose the emitted JavaScript, which actually is not to, and I know we probably want to do that. So it's not too bad, the formatting for the generated, but we can certainly go into the TypeScript and ask it inside that subscription to set a breakpoint there. And then let's zoom out and navigate. And we're right here inside of TypeScript without a problem. And then if I step over, now text is defined. Okay. Yes.
We've run into some cases where there's not typings defined for certain modules that we might use. Do you just have to hunt for those, or do you try to define it yourself?
Yes. Yeah, so that's what we typically like to end up with definitions. So if there is a definition through typings, which is, for those who don't know, it's a utility for managing descriptions that allow TypeScript to understand the API for third-party libraries. It's not available for there, like for example, Chart.js. I use that all the time. They're on 1, Chart.js is on 2. It's not fun. We'll either do the any declaration, which is terrible, and then you lose everything. What we try to do is build a definition file as we go. So we'll create an ambient definition, add the methods that we're using. So in this case, I would just do the make HTML and define that there, and then as developers go in, so it kind of grows, and then typically that official one will come in, you just swap it out or you add to it. But that is a, it's something that if it's not there, you've got a few options, but we like to have as many definitions as we can. Yes?
So now for all the JavaScripts, we have a code coverage through Istanbul or some other steps, but for the TypeScript, do you have any code coverage package?
So you can write good tests. I don't necessarily track code coverage. I'm sure there's tools that look at that. Well, we focus on a test first kind of approach on how to do that here for expediency. But anyway, I'm not going to get into philosophy of code coverage. I'm pretty sure there's code coverage tools. I don't use them that much on the client side. Cool. All right. Well, we were a few minutes before 9. I appreciate you letting me stay over. for your attention, your time, and your, is it Monday? Monday evening. So thanks, everyone.